But the benefits of like totally changing the way that the search market works, I think, are more important than any distortion that comes from the exact level of advertising that Apple had. So the question is, Apple has this very dominant position in the search market right now, and there's all sorts of harms that might come with that, right? But the question is, you want to make sure that you don't do anything that would have reduced the profits that Google made enough so that it wouldn't have been in their interest to create that from the first place. Because whatever tinkering around the edges we might say, I think almost everyone would say that the benefits that Google brought from coming into existence are so enormous that even a small chance of reducing that probability should probably outweigh the harms from it exploiting its market power, right? So smartphones and app markets are another good example of this, right? Every 6 months, there seems to be a totally new business model in terms of delivering this stuff. Yeah, go ahead, Deichi.
What you're saying is that if the prospect for profit for Google or founders of Google was smaller, then there was small probability of Google appearing?
Maybe.
I mean,
or maybe
that
not.
makes sense on some level, but
yeah.
I feel like, especially in high tech, people don't come in like expecting profit as much. I think, like, for example, Wikipedia, like, it's non-profit, but it's huge, and like a lot of people are just doing it because it's fun. I think there's, like, especially in high tech, people incentive to do things just because it's creative and people enjoy creative activities.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the extent that you think that that's true, you would want to reduce the, and in fact, we'll talk about that later. You'd want to reduce the IP protection. So in fact, we'll derive an equation where exactly that sort of thing comes into play. So, okay. So an analogy might be useful to sort of like persuade you of the importance of dynamics. So most criminal activity is by poor people against rich people, not the other way around. And in fact, your problem set is sort of about this. And there's a famous quote from Anatole France, which I actually sort of end up paraphrasing rather than directly doing here, but it's in your problem set. It says, "The law in its majestic equality forbids the poor and the rich man equally from sleeping underneath a bridge," right? So what that says is that most criminal activity is redistributive, and it often involves very little direct efficiency loss. Like if someone steals something from you, they just get it, and you don't have it anymore. It's just a transfer. But it's redistributive transfer to someone who values that probably more than you value it. So from a static efficiency perspective, crime is a great thing, right? Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Like, it seems like a lot of crime these days is at least in this area, is people stealing phones and laptops. And
that might have some efficiency loss because it's personalized in some way.
Right.
Yeah, I think that that's true. But on the other hand, those people have so much higher marginal utility of wealth than you do. You can get it replaced and it'll be a pain in the butt for you. But I think that many, many crimes you would say from a static efficiency perspective are beneficial. But that seems just on the face of it to be absurd, right? So we have to step back and ask, okay, if we arrived at this absurd conclusion, what is it that we're missing in the analysis, right? And I think the key issue is, what are the long-term or dynamic effects of crime? On the other hand, the problem set that you're doing right now has you explore whether it's really so absurd to think about things from the static efficiency perspective or not. But okay, so crime is illegal because crime being legal would encourage people to spend their time being criminals rather than being productive. It would lead to waste on people privately trying to prevent people from stealing from things. And it would lead to redistribution, perhaps above the optimal amount of redistribution that would discourage people from working hard and developing their property, right? Now, none of these things show up in the static analysis. And what that tells us is that, if we think about crime from a static perspective, we have a crazy theory of crime, right? Similarly, if we thought about industries in a static perspective, only thinking about the static dead weight losses, we would have just as crazy of a theory of industrial policy. So this is a classic argument that Gary Becker gave for why it doesn't make any sense to think about monopoly without thinking about what the monopoly incentivizes, right? Okay. So we really shouldn't get overly tied to deadweight loss triangles or all their analogs, which are like the dominant thing that people think about when they talk about an antitrust policy. It's all about like, will this lead to more competitive or less competitive? But that sort of misses a huge part of the problem, which is what innovation is incentivized by any given practice, right? Okay. So to sort of make the IP trade-off more vivid, I want to start with a model of crime. And you'll see that this actually turns out to be very related to the model of optimal IP. So let's imagine that every crime causes a harm H and receives a punishment P. And there's some demand for criminal offenses, O of P, which declines in the amount of punishment. The more punishment there is, the less crimes will be committed, right? The surplus to the offenders is then given by this equation here. And those administering punishment have a cost of doing that punishment, which depends on the level of punishment that they enforce and the number of, and multiplied by the number of offenses, right? So this means that there are two sources of inefficiency from punishment. The first is that harming the criminal here doesn't give any money to society. It's not a fine. It's just a punishment of the criminal. And it's inefficient to do that because you're just hurting the criminal and not benefiting anyone else, right? The second thing is that the harm to the criminal also actually has a cost to society, cost of putting someone in prison or of finding them, right? And so the goal is to choose the level of punishment so as to maximize the total social surplus, which is the surplus to the offenders minus the direct and indirect costs of crime, the direct being the externalities that it causes, and the indirect being the cost of enforcement. So this is a stylized version of Becker's theory of crime. Okay, so if we take derivatives, we get this, which we can rearrange and get the following famous formula, very similar to Becker's, which says that the elasticity of crime with respect to punishment multiplied by the ratio of the harm that crime causes plus the cost of punishment divided by the amount of punishment has to be equal to 1 plus the cost of punishment, the marginal cost of punishment. Now, why do we have this 1 plus the marginal cost of punishment? Because there's also the direct cost of punishment to the person who's being punished, right? So what does this tell us about when we should be enforcing more vigorously? Stieg? What should lead us to enforce more according to this equation?
Lead us to enforce more, like
have a higher degree of punishment.
higher degree of punishment. So you frame it?
Well, so we've got an equation here. There's a bunch of things that can move around.
Right.
What parameters moving around would lead us to punish more according to this equation? These are the marginal benefits of enforcement, the elasticity of crime times the ratio of harms to the amount of punishment we're giving.
Which ones increase?
Yeah.
If the elasticity goes up, we're going to want to have a higher punishment.
Exactly.
I mean, the harm to crime, obviously.
Yeah. And if the marginal cost of punishment goes down, right? Exactly. Good.
Wait, what assumptions are we making on the function C? Like, about
None, really,
first derivative?
at the moment.
Okay.
Okay, so if the deterrence effect of enforcement is larger, then you want to enforce more. if the marginal cost of punishment is low, you want to enforce more. And if the harm created by the crime is greater, you want to enforce more, right? So this theory, I think, guides and helps explain quite a few things in criminal justice. So first of all, what sort of things are explained, what sort of principles are explained by the notion that punishment should be greater for more harmful crimes? For Sean?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
What sort of features of the criminal justice system are explained by the notion that punishment should be greater if the harm from the crime is greater?
I guess a lot of very big white collar crimes, as well as really massive felonies and homicides.
Yeah. I mean, if you steal something, you go to jail for a year. If you kill someone, you go to jail for 30 years, right? So that's like the notion that the punishment should fit the crime, right? Right. Also, if the cost of apprehending people is higher, this says you should also punish people more. Because then the cost of government, or of not just apprehending, but incarcerating people, as that gets higher, you should actually be maybe, as long as it's not costly on the margin, incarcerating them more. So that's the interesting sort of double-edged side to the costs of punishment. The second is that we should try to reduce costly punishment methods in favor of less costly punishment methods. And Eric, what did Becker argue about which punishment methods were costly and which were less costly? Or what would economic principles indicate about which types of punishment we should use more or less?
Well, I guess it depends on how well you can catch people doing the crime, right? At what rate are people caught? And I think it means if it's hard to catch someone, then make the punishment greater, right?
Yeah, no, but he said that there's certain types of punishment that are costly to impose and others that are cheap, and we should try to impose the cheap ones. What did he give as examples of cheap punishment?
Would that be fines as opposed to
exactly
jail time?
Yeah, as much as possible we should use fines because they actually have a negative cost of imposing, right? And in fact, this does track practice. Whenever you can really afford to, we usually impose fines. But when it's not possible to impose fines, he said we should instead impose the least costly forms of punishment, which will tend to be like torture or corporal punishment of some sort, because that doesn't require incarcerating people for a huge period of time. That doesn't seem to match with practice very much. So, interesting question is why not? Yeah, public service could work. He also said that we should punish less and less elastic situations. And Steve, how does that match up with practice?
I don't know about what the elasticities of crime, different crimes are, but I guess doesn't seem like there's more or less murders depending on the death penalties. I don't know about
Chrissy got asked this exact question the other day.
So this is the heat of the moment versus the premeditated crime.
Yeah.
So your demand for crime is inelastic if it's in the heat of the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, they
I
change.
also feel like when you're stealing